They say that when a man reaches 75, his eyes should be fixed firmly on the sunset, resting a body that has spent a lifetime wrestling with the soil. But on a biting Tuesday morning in late October, Raymond was sitting in the third row of the Lancaster County courthouse, his calloused hands wrapped tightly around a faded leather ledger, looking toward a beginning that no one else in the room could see. The air inside the courthouse smelled faintly of old varnish, damp winter coats, and the stale dust of public records that had lain undisturbed for decades. The annual tax delinquent property auction was drawing to a close, a room full of seasoned farmers, sharp-eyed real estate developers, and out-of-town investors shuffling their papers, ready to return to their warm trucks. The auctioneer, a tired-looking man with spectacles, perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, cleared his throat and adjusted his microphone, his voice echoing flatly against the high, pressed tin ceiling. He announced the final parcel of the day. Section 14, a 60-acre tract of low-lying ground, nestled tightly along the eastern boundary of the county line. A patch of earth classified officially as non-productive wetland, completely choked with thick cattails, rotting brush, and stagnant, standing water. The starting bid was set at a meager $198, representing nothing more than the unpaid clerical fees and back taxes accumulated since the land had been abandoned over 15 years ago. A heavy silence settled over the gallery, broken only by a few hushed whispers and a quiet, mocking chuckle from a developer in the front row who didn't even bother to look up from his digital tablet. To everyone in that room, those 60 acres were a notorious geographic joke, a perpetual breeding ground for thick swarms of mosquitoes, an impenetrable mire where stray cattle routinely became trapped, and a useless sinkhole that could never support a foundation, let alone a tractor. But Raymond didn't see a wasteland. His steady gray eyes were fixed on the ancient, hand-drawn topographical maps tucked safely inside his ledger. Maps that revealed a hidden geological truth that Lancaster County had long since forgotten. As the auctioneer called out for a starting bid for the third and final time, preparing to scratch the parcel from the active registry, Raymond's weathered hand rose slowly but firmly into the chilly air of the courtroom. The auctioneer paused, his gavel hovering mid-air as a dozen heads turned in absolute disbelief to look at the solitary old farmer sitting in the back row, his jaw set with a quiet, unyielding determination. The gavel came down with a sharp, echoing crack that seemed to seal a fate that everyone in the room believed was an act of pure, senile madness, securing 60 acres of mud and mire for less than the cost of a decent pair of work boots. Raymond drove home that afternoon with the freshly stamped county deed resting quietly in his glove box, the engine of his old pickup truck humming a steady rhythm against the backdrop of the rolling Lancaster hills. When he pulled into the gravel driveway of the family homestead, his 3 grown children were already waiting for him on the front porch. Having received word of the auction via a text message from a gossiping neighbor who had been present at the courthouse, Mateo, the oldest son at 45, a successful agricultural accountant who viewed life strictly through the lens of profit margins and depreciating assets, stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his face tight with frustration. Beside him stood William, the middle son, an aggressive commercial farmer who managed hundreds of acres of prime corn and soybeans with heavy machinery and high-tech fertilizers, his expression one of pure, condescending amusement. Sarah, the youngest daughter who had moved away to the city to work in real estate marketing, leaned against the porch railing, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and deep anxiety. As Raymond stepped out of the truck, tucking his ledger under his arm, William was the first to speak, his loud voice cutting through the crisp autumn air as he shook his head and laughed openly at his father. He told Raymond that he had officially bought the most expensive mosquito farm in the state of Pennsylvania, a worthless patch of quicksand that would swallow any piece of equipment they owned within 5 seconds of driving onto the property. Mateo joined in, his tone sharp and clinical, as he pulled up a property map on his phone, demanding to know why a 75-year-old man living on a fixed income would throw away hard-earned money on a swamp that could never be drained, cultivated, or sold. Sarah stepped forward, her voice soft but heavily laced with the clinical concern of someone who had been reading articles about cognitive decline, asking her father if he was feeling entirely well or if the stress of managing the homestead alone had finally become too much for his mind to handle. They stood in a united front of modern efficiency, laughing and scolding him as if he were a reckless child, completely blind to the decades of deep land literacy that lived behind their father's quiet demeanor. Raymond didn't offer a lengthy defense, nor did he reveal the secrets hidden within the pages of his old ledger. He simply looked at his 3 children, smiled gently, and told them that some ground requires a man to look beneath the surface before he can truly understand its worth. The house was incredibly quiet that evening after his children left, the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway serving as the only companion to Raymond's solitary supper at the long oak kitchen table. It had been nearly 3 years since his beloved wife, Martha, had passed away, and her absence still lingered in the quiet corners of the room, her favorite linen apron still hanging neatly on the back of the pantry door. Raymond opened his ledger, spreading out the original 1934 county survey maps next to Martha's old handwritten kitchen journal, comparing the faded ink lines with a meticulous focus that kept the midnight chill at bay. The modern county maps labeled those 60 acres as a dead wetland. But Raymond's historic documents, which he had salvaged decades ago during his brief time serving on the local Water Conservation Board, told a radically different story. According to the original geological records, that specific tract of land sat directly atop a massive, ancient, subterranean limestone aquifer, a natural water vault that had once fed a pristine, crystal-clear artesian spring. In the mid-1970s, during the rushed construction of the new state highway bypass, the state engineers had clumsily blocked a natural limestone overflow channel with hundreds of tons of compacted gravel and asphalt debris. This careless obstruction had caused the ancient spring's water table to back up completely, flooding the surrounding 60 acres and transforming a once fertile valley into a stagnant, impenetrable swamp that everyone assumed was a natural disaster. Raymond knew that the water wasn't a curse. It was a trapped blessing, a massive volume of pure, mineral-rich liquid that had been searching for a way out for nearly 50 years, holding its breath beneath a layer of thick black muck. He traced his finger along the faded blue lines of the original channel, his heart beating with the steady excitement of a young man as he realized that the ancient limestone bedrock was still intact, waiting just a few feet beneath the surface of the mud. If a man could find the exact point of the original blockage, if he could manually clear the decades of debris without heavy machinery that would sink into the mire, the water would find its natural path again, and the buried treasure of the valley would finally be revealed. At dawn the next morning, as a heavy white frost clung to the long grass of the ditches, Raymond pulled on his tallest rubber chest waders, loaded a couple of heavy-duty trench shovels, and an iron pry bar into the bed of his truck and prepared to face the swamp alone. Raymond drove out to his newly acquired 60 acres just as the sky was turning the color of bruised iron. The property looked exactly like the wasteland his children had described. A vast gray expanse of standing water, thick mats of dead brown cattails, and the skeletal remains of old willow trees that had drowned decades ago. The air was thick with the heavy, sulphurous smell of decaying organic matter, and the mud at the edge of the road sucked violently at his boots with every single step he took into the property. He moved slowly, using a long wooden surveying pole to test the depth of the mire ahead of him, his 75-year-old joints aching against the freezing dampness of the water that rose quickly up to his thighs. To the casual observer traveling along the nearby highway, he looked like a broken old man wandering aimlessly through a graveyard of mud, a tragic figure caught in the grip of a delusion that no one else could possibly comprehend. But Raymond was reading the land by pure feel, tracking the subtle, microscopic current of the stagnant water, looking for the tiny, almost imperceptible eddies that indicated where the subterranean pressure of the hidden spring was fighting to break through the surface. He spent 8 grueling hours in the freezing swamp that first day, his hands blistering inside his leather gloves, his lower back tightening into painful knots as he carried heavy stones and cleared thick mats of decaying root systems from the old eastern boundary line. When Mateo drove past the property on his way back from an accounting client in town, he pulled his clean sedan onto the shoulder of the road, tapped his horn, and rolled down his window, yelling at his father to get out of the mud before he suffered a stroke or a heart attack. Raymond simply waved his hand, wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with a muddy sleeve, and turned back to his labor, his eyes fixed on a small patch of rising bubbles that everyone else would have ignored. By the end of the first week of solitary labor, Raymond's body was pushed to its absolute physical limits. His nights spent soaking his swollen joints in hot water and Epsom salts while his children took turns calling his house to stage an informal intervention. Sarah phoned him on Thursday night, her voice tight with a mixture of professional authority and deep emotional frustration, telling him that she had consulted with a local commercial drainage contractor who confirmed that reclaiming that specific swamp would cost upwards of $80,000 in specialized engineering fees. She begged him to let her list the property back on the county auction block for a loss, pleading with him to stop embarrassing the family by spending his remaining years digging in a public ditch like a vagrant. Raymond listened to his daughter's frantic words with a calm, gentle patience, letting her exhaust her arguments before softly telling her that some of the greatest treasures in this world cannot be bought with an accountant's checkbook or evaluated by a real estate algorithm. The next morning, he was back in the mire before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, joined now by a quiet, towering 24-year-old local young man named Caleb, an unemployed veteran who had recently returned to Lancaster County after a difficult tour of duty overseas. Caleb had been sitting on the tailgate of his old truck by the gas station, watching the old man struggle alone in the swamp for days, until his own sense of duty and quiet restlessness compelled him to walk into the mud with his own shovel and offer his strength. Raymond didn't ask Caleb about his past, nor did Caleb ask the old man about his sanity. They simply stood side by side in the freezing water, an old man at the end of his life, and a young man trying to find a reason to begin his, their shovels striking the heavy gray clay in a perfect, unspoken synchronization that began to cut a deep, narrow channel toward the old highway embankment. As the second week of November brought bitter northern winds that turned the edges of the standing water into thin sheets of clear ice, the physical toll of the project began to manifest in ways that Raymond could no longer hide from his helper. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps against the cold air, and his hands, stiffened by decades of hard farming and advanced arthritis, could barely wrap around the smooth ash handle of his favorite trenching shovel by midday. Yet, whenever Caleb urged him to return to the truck to sit before the heater, the old man would simply point toward the ancient safety maps pinned to the dashboard, his eyes burning with a deep, unshakable fire that kept his frozen boots moving through the heavy muck. They were now less than 20 yards from the old state highway bypass embankment, the exact location where Raymond believed the historic limestone drainage channel had been buried and crushed under 50 years of forgotten road debris. The water in this specific section of the swamp was deeper, reaching up to Caleb's chest in some of the low pockets, and the mud beneath their feet was a treacherous, shifting matrix of ancient river silt and decaying timber that threatened to trap them with every step. On a freezing Tuesday afternoon, as a light flurry of early winter snow began to dust the tops of the dead cattails, Raymond's shovel struck something solid and unyielding. A deep metallic thud echoing through the quiet valley that was entirely different from the soft, sucking sound of the clay. Caleb scrambled over through the thigh-deep water, his strong arms diving deep into the freezing mud to help clear away the accumulated silt, his fingers tracing the outline of a massive hand-cut block of local white limestone that formed the upper arch of the forgotten 1930s culvert. It was the original drainage throat, completely blocked by a dense, compacted plug of decaying logs, old rusted highway guardrails, and tons of hardened gravel that had completely choked the valley's lifeblood for over half a century. Raymond looked at Caleb, the gravity of what lay ahead written clearly across his weathered face. Knowing they had finally arrived at the precipice of their dangerous, unpredictable goal, the discovery of the hidden limestone arch brought a sudden electric tension to the property, a sense of immediate, high-stakes danger that caused both men to work with a frantic, focused energy as the gray afternoon light began to rapidly fade. They were working directly beneath the unstable, crumbling shoulder of the old highway embankment, an area where decades of soil erosion and heavy truck traffic had left the earth loose, precarious, and prone to sudden mudslides. Raymond knew with absolute certainty that if they pulled the wrong log or dislodged the key boulder, holding back the immense structural weight of the blockage too quickly, the trapped water table would burst forth with catastrophic, explosive force, risking burying them both alive beneath a wall of liquid mud and heavy stone. He instructed Caleb to climb back onto the safety of the firm gravel bank with the heavy iron tow chain, attaching one end to the frame of his old four-wheel drive pickup truck, while Raymond remained alone in the freezing ditch, carefully driving thick wooden wedges around the base of the central obstruction to control the pressure. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, the old, familiar strength of his youth returning to his muscles for one brief, beautiful moment as he jammed the long iron pry bar deep into the throat of the blocked limestone arch, utilizing every single ounce of his remaining body weight to leverage a massive rotting timber that had held the swamp in place for 50 years. With a terrifying, deep, subterranean groan that shook the very ground beneath his waders, the ancient timber shifted a mere 2 inches and a thin, violent jet of highly pressurized, crystal-clear water erupted through the cracked mortar, spraying high into the freezing winter air like a geyser. Caleb scrambled for his father to run, his voice filled with pure panic as the entire bank began to violently vibrate. But Raymond stayed his ground for one final, crucial second, throwing his entire weight against the iron bar to break the primary seal before scrambling up the slippery clay slope just as the entire limestone throat gave way with a deafening, roaring explosion of water, mud, and flying stone. The force of the sudden release was absolutely staggering. A roaring, chocolate-colored torrent of accumulated swamp water and ancient silt tearing through the newly dug channel with the raw, unchecked violence of a broken dam, carrying away decades of dead brush and rotting logs as it rushed toward the lower county creek beds. For nearly 3 hours, Raymond and Caleb stood silently on the high gravel shoulder of the road, wrapped in old wool blankets, watching the massive volume of standing water rapidly drain off the 60 acres. The vast, flooded wasteland vanishing before their very eyes, like a mirage disappearing in the desert sun. By the time the moon rose high and clear over the Lancaster Valley, casting a bright silver light across the landscape, the stagnant, foul-smelling swamp was completely gone, replaced by an expansive, gently sloping bowl of exposed, rich bottomland that no living soul in the county had seen since the mid-1970s. But it was what remained at the absolute center of the deep basin that caused Caleb to drop his shovel in pure awe and brought hot, silent tears streaming down the deep wrinkles of Raymond's weathered cheeks. There, bubbling up through a magnificent, wide fissure in the natural limestone bedrock, was the ancient artesian spring, a powerful, steady column of crystal-clear, pure water that caught the moonlight like a river of liquid diamonds, flowing gracefully into a beautifully preserved natural stone basin. The water was so pure that it didn't hold a single trace of the surrounding mud, its intense, constant pressure creating a beautiful, low, musical hum that echoed through the quiet valley, a voice of the earth that had been completely silenced for 50 years, finally singing its way back to the surface. Raymond walked down into the basin, his boots sinking into a thick, velvety layer of black soil that felt like pure gold beneath his feet, a pristine, undisturbed deposit of glacial loam that had been perfectly preserved beneath the water for half a century, an ultra-fertile ground completely untouched by modern chemical farming or depleted by decades of overcultivation. He knelt by the water, running his hand through the cool flow, knowing that the real work and the real battle with his family's doubts was only just beginning. The news of the old man's miraculous reclamation project tore through the local farming community like a summer wildfire, transforming the quiet Lancaster crossroads into a bustling hub of curiosity, skepticism, and sudden, intense commercial speculation within 48 hours. William was the first of the children to arrive at the property. On Saturday morning, his heavy commercial truck tearing onto the shoulder of the road, his jaw dropping in absolute stunned silence as he stared out at the beautiful, completely drained valley where his father and Caleb were already laying out neat, precise rows with long spools of surveyor's twine. He stepped down into the dry basin, reaching down to scoop up a fistful of the dark, rich soil, running his experienced fingers through the velvety loam before realizing with a shock of pure professional jealousy that this once worthless swamp possessed a higher organic matter content and structural quality than the absolute best prime acreage he managed down the valley. The very next day, Mateo arrived, accompanied by a prominent agricultural land appraiser from the city, his accounting spreadsheets completely forgotten, as the appraiser walked the perimeter of the artesian spring, estimating that the constant, high-volume flow of pure, certified mineral-rich water represented an absolute gold mine for high-end organic irrigation or premium bottling rights, valuing the once $198 parcel at well over $500,000 in its current raw state. Sarah arrived later that evening, her real estate folder trembling in her hands as she looked at the magnificent limestone springhouse foundation that Caleb had carefully uncovered near the water's edge, a beautiful historic structure that could serve as the breathtaking centerpiece for an elite, multi-million-dollar agri-tourism estate. They stood around their father in a circle of sudden, overwhelming reverence and commercial greed, each of them offering brilliant business plans, high-tech corporate partnerships, and massive development strategies to maximize the immediate financial fortune that had suddenly dropped into their family's lap. But Raymond listened to their ambitious, fast-talking financial proposals with the same quiet, detached calm that he had maintained when they were laughing at him from the front porch of the old homestead, his hand resting gently on the cool, wet limestone of the ancient spring basin. He looked at Mateo, then at William, and finally into the wide, anxious eyes of Sarah, seeing how the pressure of the modern world had filled his children with a deep, perpetual anxiety, a modern sickness that forced them to view every beautiful creation of God strictly as a transaction to be bought, sold, or exploited for leverage. He told them with a soft but unyielding firmness that this land would never be sold to a corporate developer, nor would it be carved into luxury estates for wealthy city commuters, or pumped dry by a commercial water bottling conglomerate to line their family bank accounts with paper wealth. Instead, Raymond revealed his true, deeply emotional plan for the 60 acres. He was officially establishing the Martha Memorial Community Farm Trust, transforming the entire valley into a beautiful, permanent cooperative sanctuary where young, landless local families, struggling military veterans like Caleb, and local elderly folks could cultivate their own organic plots, find their connection to the soil, and heal their spirits beside the quiet, constant music of the ancient spring. He looked at his 3 children, whose faces were a complex mixture of sudden shame, profound confusion, and lingering greed, and told them that the greatest fortune a man can leave to his descendants is not a mountain of cold, depreciating cash, but a living legacy of stewardship, a patch of earth that leaves the world, a little more beautiful, a little more healed, and a little more connected than how he found it. He turned back to the rich earth, picking up his twine, leaving his children to stand in the fading light, entirely transformed by the weight of his words. The following spring brought a magnificent, breathtaking transformation to the valley, a vibrant explosion of green life and human connection that completely rewrote the social fabric of the entire Lancaster County countryside. The vast Black Basin was now an intricately patterned mosaic of lush raised vegetable beds, vibrant rows of heirloom grains, and a sprawling orchard of young apple and peach trees whose deep roots found a permanent, endless supply of pure mineral water within the limestone aquifer below. On any given Saturday morning, the property was alive with the beautiful, chaotic symphony of human life. Young children running down the clean gravel paths with wooden buckets, old retired farmers teaching city slickers how to properly prune tomato vines, and war-weary veterans working silently in the rich soil beside Caleb, their faces losing the tight, hyper-vigilant strain of trauma as their hands connected with the gentle, grounding reality of growing things. Raymond sat on a beautifully carved cedar bench beneath a wide timber shelter that William had quietly built over the spring house foundation, his old body visibly failing now, his breathing heavily supported by a small oxygen tank, but his eyes brighter and more filled with peace than they had been since the day Martha died. He watched his 3 children working together in the lower strawberry patches, completely unrecognizable from the sharp, cynical professionals who had mocked him in the courthouse just a few short months ago. Mateo was carefully managing the cooperative's nonprofit books with a gentle generosity. William was using his heavy machinery to deliver free compost to the elderly plots, and Sarah was utilizing her marketing skills to distribute thousands of pounds of free organic produce to inner-city food banks and local shelters. They had finally found their way back to the true meaning of the family name, their hearts slowly but thoroughly healed of the modern world's cold isolation by the pure, unselfish act of digging in their mother's memorial garden, discovering that the old man had not lost his mind in the swamp, but had instead discovered the long-lost wellspring of their family's salvation. As the golden evening light of a late August sunset began to cast long, beautiful shadows across the thriving rows of corn, Raymond closed his old leather ledger for the very last time, resting his tired head back against the warm cedar posts of the springhouse shelter as a deep, comfortable silence settled over his soul. He could hear the distant, joyous laughter of his grandchildren splashing their bare feet in the cool overflow channel, the steady, rhythmic crunch of Caleb's boots, walking up the gravel path to check on him, and the constant, beautiful musical hum of the ancient artesian spring flowing steady, pure, and eternal through the heart of the valley. He had kept his promise to Martha. He had saved his children from the cold trap of their own ambition, and he had anchored a whole community of lonely souls to a piece of earth that would feed them for generations to come, leaving behind a fortune that could never be measured by an appraiser's tool or stolen by a fluctuating market. If this deeply moving journey of Raymond, his unyielding faith in the hidden treasures of the earth, and the beautiful, emotional healing of his family has touched your heart today, please take one quiet moment to show your support for our work. Hit that like button right now to help us share these powerful, inspiring stories of rural resilience with millions of viewers across the globe who are searching for hope in a fragmented world. Share this video with your family, your friends, and anyone you know who needs to be reminded that the most valuable things in this life are often completely hidden beneath the mud, waiting for a pair of wise eyes to see their true worth. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell so you never miss a single chapter of these cinematic, heartwarming tales from the forgotten corners of the countryside. We thank you from the bottom of our hearts for watching, for being an essential part of our storytelling community, and we look forward to seeing you in our next video.